The Dark Scrolls. They found the boy's body beside the fish pond. The water was calm, tranquil even, but beneath the surface, piranha-like lampreys swirled in slow circles, bloated from feeding. A few strands of cloth clung to the stones near the edge, fluttering like flags in defeat. What had once been a 14-year-old slave, guilty of breaking a crystal goblet, was now unrecognizable, offered to the pond as punishment. His master, Vedius Pollio, a Roman of means and cruelty, had done it without a second thought. That wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was this. No one was surprised. In ancient Rome, a slave was not a person. He was property, alive, breathing, crying perhaps, but still no different than a chair, a tunic, or a horse. And when property displeased you, you broke it. You discarded it. You fed it to the eels if that was your taste. But even in that vast empire of marble and blood, there were limits. Or at least, there began to be. This is the story of what Roman slave owners couldn't do, or weren't supposed to. Of the blurry, uncomfortable edge where absolute power began to tremble, where even the might of a Roman paterfamilias could be questioned. It's a story of cruelty, yes, but also of resistance, reform, and the earliest stirrings of something Rome rarely knew, mercy. And to tell it, we must begin not with a law book, but with a scream. The Roman world ran on slavery. Every column, every aqueduct, every victory parade through the Forum was soaked with the sweat of enslaved men and women. At its height, as many as 1 in 3 people walking through the streets of Rome were slaves. And not just manual laborers. There were slave doctors, philosophers, musicians, tutors, scribes. From the exotic to the invisible, they oiled the gears of empire. Their masters, untouchable. With the power of viti nisique potestas, the power of life and death, they could beat, starve, rape, or kill their slaves at will. A bad harvest? Blame the slaves. A sour mood? Take it out on their backs. But even monsters have boundaries, and Rome, with all its decadence, did not escape the long arm of conscience forever. It began slowly, so slowly that most Romans didn't notice. A whisper under Augustus, a murmur under Claudius, a ripple under Nero. Eventually, those ripples became law. The first real tremor came under Emperor Claudius. Claudius was no soft-hearted ruler. He had ascended to power through a web of betrayal and poison. But he saw something deeply disturbing in one of Rome's ugliest customs, the abandonment of sick or injured slaves. When a slave became too ill to work, some masters would simply throw them out, often to die on an island in the Tiber River, treated no better than broken pottery. It was a quiet execution, not of violence but of neglect. And it was legal, until Claudius changed the rules. He decreed that any slave who was abandoned by his master and who somehow survived would be granted freedom. Moreover, the former master would not be allowed to reclaim him and could be prosecuted if he tried. This was not kindness. It was Roman efficiency disguised as morality. Claudius wanted order, not sentiment. But for the first time in Roman history, the state had inserted itself between a master and his slave and said, "No, you may not do this." A crack had formed. Still, that crack barely showed. The average Roman citizen would have dismissed Claudius's law as a technicality. In most homes, the brutal rhythms of slavery continued unchecked. But within the legal codes, those cold marble slabs of logic and decree, more cracks were growing. Under Emperor Nero, the law took a sharper turn. A master who killed his slave without justification could now, technically, be charged with murder. Of course, that word, justification, was a convenient loophole. What Roman court would doubt a senator's word that his slave had tried to steal or disrespected the household gods? And yet, it was a law. Not a suggestion, not a custom, a law that for the first time placed a faint question mark next to the master's divine right to destroy what he owned. It was as though the state were whispering, "They are not entirely yours." That whisper would soon grow louder. But while the emperors chiseled away at cruelty with words, Rome's elite responded with fire and teeth. Some masters took to branding their slaves not just with marks of ownership, but with mutilation, cutting tendons to prevent escape, sewing shut lips, piercing ears with iron rings, not for beauty, but for humiliation. They turned their villas into private theaters of torment, masked as discipline. They told themselves it was their right, and their right alone, to rule absolutely over the creatures they bought. And for most of Roman history, they were right. But then came Antoninus Pius. If Claudius was the bureaucrat and Nero the enigma, then Antoninus was the philosopher king. A ruler of the 2nd century CE, his reign was marked by rare peace and a flurry of reforms, many of them, shockingly, aimed at limiting the abuse of slaves. Antoninus declared that masters who killed their slaves without legal cause would be prosecuted. But more than that, he gave slaves a voice, not freedom, but voice. For the first time, a slave could appeal to a magistrate if they were being abused. If the court believed their case, the slave could be taken away and sold to a new master. It wasn't mercy, it was market correction. But to the ears of those who had been voiceless for centuries, it was thunder. Still, the Roman world did not bend easily. For every law passed, 10 brutalities went unpunished. The fish ponds of Vedius Pollio did not vanish, but somewhere in the dusty scrolls of law, the echo of that scream began to shape a boundary. Not between slave and free, but between what Rome had been and what it might one day be. And in that echo we begin to see the truth. Even in an empire built on chains, there were some things, just a few, that a master could no longer do. There was a villa outside Capua where the cries never stopped. Locals said they could hear them echoing from the hills at night, sharp, rhythmic, inhuman. A chorus of agony just beyond the olive groves. The master there was famous, or perhaps infamous, a man of intellect, taste, and discipline. He trained his slaves like war dogs, shackled them to iron treadmills for hours, forced them to march in circles grinding flour with their backs bent and mouths muzzled. When they collapsed, he poured boiling water down their throats, convinced weakness was a kind of moral failing. He never faced a single charge, because in ancient Rome there was no such thing as excessive punishment when it came to your own slave. You could whip them for sneezing wrong, burn them for dropping a plate, sleep with them, then sell them the next day for being spoiled merchandise. You were God in your household, and your property had no soul. So what was there to violate? And yet, the line was shifting, quietly, not because of pity, but because of control. By the 2nd century, the Roman legal system had grown obsessed with codifying everything. There was a scroll for how to measure roads, another for water distribution, and many, far too many, for slaves. One such law, buried in the digest of Justinian, warned masters against irrational cruelty toward their slaves, not out of compassion, but because tortured slaves were unprofitable. A dead slave could not work. A terrified one might rebel. A maimed one was harder to sell. Rome, ever the machine, had realized that brutality, like rust, wore down the gears. So new legal whispers emerged. You may not kill a slave arbitrarily. You may not sell a slave to a gladiator school unless they were born into it. You may not brand a slave without registration. And most curiously of all, you may not force a slave into prostitution, at least not one who belonged to someone else. This last point reveals a strange wrinkle in Roman morality. Masters could, and often did, use their own slaves sexually without fear of consequence. Men, women, children. It didn't matter. No law prevented it. Consent was never considered. A master's desire was law within his walls, but if a man laid with another's slave without permission, that was theft, not of the slave's body, but of the owner's value. Imagine a world where rape was punished not for the suffering it caused the victim, but for the economic loss it brought to someone else. That was Rome. And yet, ironically, this logic began to open doors, because the moment the state began regulating how a master could use his slave, what acts were forbidden, what boundaries existed, it was also quietly admitting that there were boundaries. And boundaries, no matter how fragile, are the first sign of rights. The story of Aelia Pulcheria offers a glimpse into that tension. She was a noblewoman in the city of Arretium, known for her virtue and devotion to the gods. But behind her marble courtyard she kept a young slave girl named Tyra, 16, pale-skinned, a captive from Thrace. Tyra was not a laborer, she was a plaything. And when Aelia's husband grew bored of her, Tyra became his nightly companion. Eventually, the girl grew pregnant. Aelia, furious, accused Tyra of seduction and had her beaten until she miscarried. The case made it to a local magistrate, not because of Tyra's suffering, but because the child, if born, would have been considered houseborn property, and therefore a loss of future labor value. The court ruled that Aelia's punishment had been excessive and fined her, not for violence, but for damaging her own estate's assets. It was a twisted logic. But it was the first time the court acknowledged that a slave's body was not a punching bag, that within Rome's profit-driven soul, a shadow of human worth had emerged. Not light, just shadow, but enough to make the powerful nervous. Around this time, under Marcus Aurelius and his successors, more laws surfaced like fragile flowers in stone. Some provinces saw tribunals established to hear slave complaints. A few even allowed testimony from slaves, under torture, of course, because Romans believed slaves only told the truth when screaming. Still, the idea that a slave might influence law was radical. In one recorded case, a slave named Publius Servandus accused his master of attempting to castrate him out of jealousy. The court dismissed the charge but transferred Servandus to a new household, not because the claim was proven, but because the moral health of the home had been disturbed. Translation: the scandal was bad for reputation, but that too was something. Because for most of Roman history, a slave's suffering was less than the sound of a dropped coin. Now, suddenly, people were listening, not because they cared, but because they feared being seen as cruel. That fear reached its peak in the infamous case of the 400. In the year 61 CE, a Roman senator named Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one of his household slaves. No one knew which one. The law at the time stated that if a master was killed by a slave, and the murderer could not be identified, then every slave in the household would be executed as a warning. Pedanius had 400 slaves, men, women, children, all sentenced to death. The people of Rome rioted, not out of pity but panic. The idea that hundreds could die for the crime of one terrified the mob. Senators defended the law, citing tradition. The executions proceeded. And yet the debate marked a turning point. For the first time, Roman society publicly questioned whether all property rights were sacred, whether punishment without distinction could backfire, whether the godlike authority of the paterfamilias was too great. They did not abolish the law, but the seed of doubt was planted. Let's not romanticize this moment. Rome was still a world of chains. For every crack in the system, there were walls of brutality holding strong. A slave caught stealing could still be crucified. A disobedient maid might still be flayed. A tutor who taught a forbidden philosophy could be gagged and buried alive. But somewhere in marble courts and whispered decrees, the state had begun to say, no. Not often, not clearly, but undeniably. No, you may not kill them without reason. No, you may not rape them if they belong to someone else. No, you may not discard them once they are sick. And eventually, the most radical whisper of all, no, you may not be their god. By the end of the 2nd century, Roman slave law had become a paradox. It still saw human beings as property, but it layered that ownership with rules, caveats, and red tape. Why? Because the machine was overheating. Slave revolts were becoming more common. From the Spartacus rebellion to local insurrections in Sicily and Gaul, Rome had learned the cost of pushing too far. A broken man might be silent, but too many broken men gathered together. That was a war, and so Rome did what Rome always did. It compromised, not with freedom, but with management. Slaves became assets to be preserved, not destroyed. Beaten but not broken, controlled but not killed. They were still prisoners, but prisoners with policies. And in that cold calculus of empire, something strange began to grow. An idea that even the lowest had limits, that even chains had laws, that even the gods of the household were not above the state. In the shadows of the Colosseum, under the flickering oil lamps of Senate halls, on the cracked stone steps of provincial courts, that idea pulsed, dim, fragile, but alive. Rome would never call it justice, but for some it was the only breath of it they would ever know. They called him the Quiet One. He had no name of his own. His master never gave him one. The other slaves, too afraid to be noticed, simply referred to him in whispers. The Quiet One worked in the atrium, kept the tiles spotless, trimmed the cypress trees, and when summoned, brought water without a word, until the day the master's wife disappeared. No one knows exactly what happened. Rumors swirled, infidelity, jealousy, poison, when her body was found floating near the Tiber, bloated and bloomed like a tragic lily. The master accused the Quiet One. There was no trial, just one sentence: crucifixion. But before the sentence could be carried out, something happened that shook the very pillars of the Roman legal world. A neighbor, a patrician himself, stepped forward and said, "This slave has always been silent, but I have seen the bruises. I have heard the screams. I do not believe he killed her." The magistrate hesitated. A slave could not testify unless tortured. That was the law. But this was not a trial. It was a command. And for once the command cracked. The case was delayed, investigated. The real murderer, another slave caught fleeing with stolen jewelry, was exposed. And the Quiet One lived. He was not freed. He was returned to the house. But in that pause, in that hesitation, Rome had blinked. Just for a moment the silence had spoken back. It would be comforting to say this story changed everything. It didn't, but it revealed something. That Roman law, so rigid, so merciless, was not stone. It could be bent, warped, even, on rare occasions, reshaped. By the 3rd century, the empire was rotting from within. Plagues had swept through the cities. The military was overextended. Emperors rose and fell like dice tossed in blood. And in the cracks of that chaos, new ideas crept in, soft-footed, dangerous. One of them was this: slaves were not just tools. They were potential threats, potential witnesses, potential liabilities. And so laws were updated, not to empower slaves, but to protect the empire from what might happen if they were treated too brutally. Consider the Lex Patronia, passed in the 1st century, but enforced more broadly in later centuries. It stated that a master could no longer send his slave to the beasts in the arena without approval from a magistrate. Again, not kindness, just bureaucracy. But what a revelation it was, For the first time, the state had said, "You must ask permission before turning a man into entertainment." For a society that had once fed slaves to lions while children cheered, this was not just a legal reform, it was a moral fracture. Then came Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian was many things: a soldier, a builder, a lover of Greek boys and Greek ideals. But he was also, in his own way, a reformer. He abolished the private execution of slaves. From now on, if a slave was to be killed, it had to be under official authority: courts, judges, documents. He banned the castration of slaves, a widespread practice among Roman elites who sought eunuchs for their households. And though many continued the practice in secret, the law now stood against it. He even visited homes accused of abuse, not because he cared deeply, but because he saw that cruelty led to rebellion, and rebellion bled empires dry. Hadrian's laws did not come from a place of empathy. They came from fear. But fear, too, can build strange bridges. Let's take a moment to imagine what daily life was like for a slave under these new restrictions. You wake before the sun. You clean. You serve. You carry messages through crowded streets. You sleep on straw. You eat last and little. You are ordered to smile. You are forbidden to speak unless spoken to. But your master now hesitates to beat you in public. He flinches before marking your face with a hot iron. He threatens to sell you to a farm in Africa, but he does not send you to the lions. He knows someone somewhere might be watching: a neighbor, a rival, a magistrate hungry for a new scandal. This is not freedom, not even close, but it is a whisper of accountability. And in Rome, even whispers echo for centuries. The paradox grew sharper. Rome claimed to own its slaves, body and soul, but it had now written into law the concept that abuse could be illegal. This raised impossible questions. How could you abuse something that wasn't a person? How could an object suffer? How could property testify? Rome had no good answers, so it pretended not to ask. Instead, it cloaked its contradictions in legalese. Slaves were property, but sensitive property. You could discipline them, but within reason. You could sell them, but not for certain immoral purposes. It was like trying to justify tormenting a mirror, then being surprised when it cracked and showed your reflection. A case in Gaul, preserved on fragmentary wax tablets, gives us a haunting example. A slave named Briccius was accused of striking his master's son. The boy had called him dog, thrown stones at his head. Briccius, after 3 strikes, shoved the boy down a stair. The boy broke his arm. The master ordered Briccius's tongue cut out. The local magistrate intervened, not because of compassion, but because Briccius was a record keeper. He could write. He was trained in Greek. And if his tongue was removed, the household would lose an educated servant, and tax filings would suffer. So the punishment was reduced. Briccius was whipped, then reassigned to a remote estate far from the capital. Again, not mercy, but it showed a new logic. Slaves were not only labor, they were investments, and hurting them too much was bad business. Rome had found morality through money. Of course, all of this, every law, every reform, every glimmer of restraint, was framed by hypocrisy. The same Rome that said, "Don't kill your slave without cause," also sent tens of thousands to die in mines, where life expectancy was 6 months. The same Rome that banned slave castration allowed slave breeding farms, where women were forcibly impregnated to produce more laborers. The same Rome that protected slaves from unjust torture still allowed torture as a form of interrogation in courts. And above all, no matter how many reforms were made, not one of them questioned the core premise that owning another human being was wrong. Not one law ever said, "You cannot own a person." They only said, "You must own them carefully." That is Rome's greatest silence. But silence is never complete. And in the later centuries of the empire, a new force began to rise: Christianity. Not the Christianity of modern churches, but the underground, radical Christianity of early martyrs, who spoke in whispers and carried scripture in jars. They believed, at least in theory, that all souls were equal before God. Slave master, woman, man. This idea terrified Rome, because it unraveled the entire order. If a slave could be a child of God, then how could he be sold? If Christ died for all, then why did some die in chains? At first, the emperors tried to ignore it, then suppress it, then co-opt it. But the questions remained, and by the 4th century, the lines between Roman law and Christian doctrine began to blur. A few brave bishops began to buy the freedom of slaves. Some monasteries offered sanctuary. Emperors like Constantine began to issue edicts limiting the branding of slaves, prohibiting Sunday labor, and even encouraging manumission in churches. It was not revolution, but it was erosion. The idea of ownership itself was beginning to feel unstable. One final story. It comes from a letter preserved in the Vatican archives, written in shaky Latin by a former slave named Anicetus. He had served as senator for 22 years. In that time, he had learned to read, to write, to keep books. He had watched 3 wives die in childbirth, none of them free. And when his master died, Anicetus was granted manumission, freedom, but he didn't know what to do with it. "I do not know how to walk without orders," he wrote. "I do not know how to pray without permission. I wake still waiting for the bell." He ended the letter with a sentence that echoes like thunder through time. "I am free, but I am not yet a person." That was the legacy of Rome, an empire that could build roads across continents, but could not cross the road from power to empathy. It left behind scrolls of law, monuments of marble, amphitheaters carved into mountains. But it never gave a name to the quiet one, never truly heard Brictius, never replied to Anicetus. And in its greatest contradiction, it taught the world what not to be, while pretending to be the apex of civilization. But buried in the ruins, in broken chains and whispered laws, a truth survives. Even empires fear their slaves. Even gods tremble when they bleed. And sometimes the silence of the oppressed becomes the loudest sentence history ever writes. The year is 476 CE. In Ravenna, a boy emperor named Romulus Augustulus is dethroned. His robes are stripped, his ring is taken. And with that, the Western Roman Empire, bloated, broken, and blind, collapses into the dust of legend. But what of the slaves? What of the millions who toiled unseen beneath the marble, whose names never made it into scrolls or songs? The empire died. The chains remained. Historians often say Rome fell because of barbarians, Visigoths, Vandals, Hungarians. They speak of borders breached, cities sacked, legions defeated. But long before any spear struck a gate, Rome had already begun to decay from within. The rot was not just economic, it was moral, and nowhere was this more evident than in the contradictions of slavery. For centuries, Rome had taught itself a dangerous lie, that you could own a human being and still call yourself civilized, that brutality could wear the mask of law, that silence was peace. But every whisper, every broken body buried in secret, every scream heard through villa walls, it all accumulated. Not just in history, in memory, in soul, in the soul of an empire. In the final centuries, as emperors turned to marble statues of gods for answers, the laws surrounding slaves grew stranger, more detailed, more fragile. Slaves could no longer be forced to fight in arenas unless guilty of a crime. But what counted as a crime? Disobedience? Running away? Sleeping with the wrong person? Slaves could now buy their freedom if they had saved enough from scraps, an ironic gift given that many were never paid at all. Slaves were even, on rare occasions, allowed to marry, though the marriage could be broken at any time by a master's whim. These were not rights, they were shadows of rights, echoes of what freedom might one day mean. Rome was not freeing its slaves, it was softening their cages. Yet even in this, Rome could not help but expose itself. One law, passed under Emperor Constantine, declared that a slave who reported a master's plot to commit treason could be rewarded with manumission. Pause on that. A slave, a voiceless, nameless tool, could now, in one specific case, bring down their own master. The empire, obsessed with survival, had turned the very lowest into potential witnesses, spies, and in doing so it admitted a terrifying truth, that even the people Rome had dehumanized most could still hold the key to its fate. There are no grand monuments to the Roman slaves, no towering columns carved in their image, no epic poems about their labor, their suffering, their dreams. But they are everywhere in Rome. They are the grooves in the marble floors, worn smooth by bare feet, carrying amphorae. They are the ghosts behind the frescoes, silent, blurred, holding platters, instruments, towels. They are the children who never saw adulthood, the women whose bodies bore the price of their owner's pleasure, the men who died not with names, but with inventory numbers burned into their skin. And yet, some of them endured and changed everything. In 212 CE, Emperor Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, granting Roman citizenship to all free men within the empire. On the surface, it had nothing to do with slaves, but it was the first time Rome officially erased the line between foreign and Roman blood. One empire, one people. The idea that a man from Syria, or Gaul, or Numidia could be just as Roman as a senator from Latium would have been unthinkable a century earlier. And once that line blurred, once Rome became not a race but an idea, another line trembled, the line between slave and free. If citizenship could be expanded once, why not again? If Rome could change one definition of humanity, why not another? It didn't happen in one generation, but the seed had been planted. We often ask, what couldn't Roman masters do to their slaves? But perhaps the better question is, what couldn't Rome do to itself by allowing slavery to flourish? The empire taught itself to justify horrors. It wrapped torture in legal clauses. It called rape a form of ownership. It built monuments on the bones of the voiceless and then forgot them. And in doing so, it trained generations to look away, not just from cruelty, but from conscience. And that blindness is fatal. Even today, when tourists walk through the Roman Forum, they marvel at the arches, the statues, the colonnades. They pose with gelato beside temples, snap selfies beside ruins. But few realize that beneath those stones, there are stories the empire never wanted told. A girl named Licinia, sold at 9, who learned to sing so sweetly her master refused to let her speak. A man named Diocles, who taught a senator's son Greek, then was hanged when the boy failed his exams. A woman named Sabra, who bore 6 children in chains and saw all of them sold before they could say, "Mother." None of them have tombs, but all of them left something behind, a crack, a question, a resistance. The Christianization of Rome, as slow and political as it was, became a strange vessel for that resistance. By the time of Emperor Theodosius, the empire officially embraced Christianity. And while the church did not condemn slavery outright, it had its own slaves after all, it introduced a new language into the empire's bloodstream. A language of souls, of equality before God, of salvation not reserved for the rich. Bishops began to argue quietly that masters should be merciful, not because it was profitable, but because it was divine. Some monasteries declared that any slave baptized was spiritually equal to his master. This did not end slavery, but it did something far more dangerous. It made people uncomfortable. It whispered to them in the stillness of prayer. What if the slave you whipped yesterday sits beside you in heaven? What if God watches what you do behind closed doors? What if ownership is not eternal? And then, centuries later, in the shadow of Rome's fall, that whisper became thunder. Monks and priests began freeing slaves in their wills. St. Augustine, once a Roman citizen steeped in empire, wrote that it is better to be a slave to man than to sin before God, but also argued that spiritual freedom mattered more than social bondage. The contradictions remained, but the wall had cracked, and through it poured something the Romans had never been able to fully understand: conscience. So what couldn't Roman owners do to their slaves? By the end of the empire, they could not kill them in secret. They could not mutilate them in public without facing shame. They could not sell them to death without a reason. They could not stop them from praying. They could not stop them from dreaming. And most terrifying of all, they could not stop them from remembering. Because history remembers what power tries to erase. It remembers the quiet one who didn't scream when accused. It remembers Brictius, who was spared because he knew how to write. It remembers Anicetus, who became free but still woke waiting for the bell. And it remembers every Roman master who believed that cruelty was eternal. They were wrong. The empire is gone. But the names of the nameless endure, in the cracks of law, in the tears of survivors, in the stones that still hold echoes. And now you remember them too. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.